can say, and I'm sad to say it, but I've been doing this for 42 years. I've worked in about 145 countries around the world. I've been a senior UN advisor for almost a quarter century straight. The U.S. government almost never tells the truth about anything. This is a problem, So I don't know the answer to your question because we don't hear the truth.
On a slightly different angle here, Ola Nasir wants to know: can you tell us how you will support the UN and the ICJ achieve their rulings?
Yeah, very interesting. First of all, as people know, there are two courts, the International Court of Justice, ICJ, and the International Criminal Court. Both are in play right now. The ICJ is the one that's hearing the complaint of South Africa brought under the 1948 Genocide Convention. And there was already a preliminary ruling of the ICJ that said it is plausible that Israel is in violation of the Genocide Convention and that it must immediately take all measures to stop those violations. And immediately Israel completely neglected the ICJ judgment, and the United States brushed it off again with that terrible Admiral Kirby at the White House and his smirking, lying manner every day, brushed it off as if our international court didn't just say that there are plausible grounds that Israel is making a genocide. Oh my God. And we brushed it off with the back of a hand. That's the arrogance of this administration. The ICC goes after individuals that are committing war crimes. And today, the prosecutor of the ICC tweeted that he's under absolutely improper pressure regarding the investigation into Israeli offenses, because it has been said in recent days, again, I have no inside information on this, that the ICC is considering indictments of Netanyahu and other members or other members of the Israeli cabinet. And we've heard behind the scenes, of course, intense lobbying by Israel to have the United States crush the ICC possible indictment and so forth. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, but there was something up in front with the prosecutors saying, don't pressure me. That itself is a violation of the Rome statutes of this court. So both are in play. The United States acts with impunity. Israel acts with impunity because the United States backs up Israel's impunity. Impunity means international law, not for us. That's for them, not for us. But this is completely reckless, immoral, illegal, intolerable, and dangerous for us. So if there is a ruling of the ICJ in the action brought by South Africa, and I had a wonderful discussion with the South African foreign minister recently. She is absolutely amazing, Minister Pandor. Wonderful. This will be such a profound moment, and it is one I think that will reverberate through history, and I think it will again show the whole world the United States in these administrations with this military-industrial complex dominating both parties is standing absolutely on the side of injustice. This ruling could come basically anytime. It can come sometime in the next few months. I heard from my professor, who was beloved of the magic of the marketplace. Don't worry about it. The market will solve these problems. The limits to growth is about scarcity, but markets will price the scarcity. Goods and resources in scarce supply will rise in market price, and that will change incentives. And so I was told as a first-year student at Harvard University, limits to growth is not right. Anyway, it was written by MIT professors, not Harvard professors. So what do they know? Well, 50 years onward, I think I got bad advice from my introductory economics professor, and I've been grappling with this subject myself during the past 50 years. We have, at the core, failed to change the trajectory of the planet from 50 years ago until today. The limits to growth scenario, though not right in every particular, has depicted more or less the dynamics of the planet during the past 50 years. We have a continuing intensification of multiple environmental crises, all interlinked. The three great environmental crises that we face are, of course, human-induced climate change, the destruction of biodiversity and derangement of ecosystems, and the third is the mega pollution of the air, the water, the soils, the oceans. So this trilogy of environmental damage at human hands, anthropogenic damage, has given rise in the interim to the neologism of the Anthropocene, that we are in a new geologic era of the Earth shaped by human activity. It's led to new concepts being introduced, most notably sustainable development, introduced in 1987, and the notion of planetary boundaries, which will appeal to judges as limits against which we should not trespass without the threat of deranging the Earth's ecosystems. And there are multiple planetary boundaries that are being transgressed or trespassed in our time. Now, 50 years has been the occasion of innumerable conferences that followed, especially the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, the Rio +20 Earth Summit in 2012, the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, and of course, 26 conferences of the parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. None of this has fundamentally changed the self-destructive trajectory of human activity on the planet. All of these crises continue to worsen. We have not even reached the turning point, the peak of greenhouse gas emissions. Those continue to rise each year, but we need not only to have a downturn of emissions, we need to reach near or at net zero in order to stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and we're not anywhere remotely in that target zone. The planet has warmed by 1.2 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial level, which many climate scientists take as the average temperature of 1880 to 1920. 1.2 degrees Celsius warming puts us above the entire temperature range of the 10,000 years of civilizational history. We are increasing temperatures at above 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. We will most likely breach the 1.5 degrees Celsius target set in the Paris Climate Agreement within this decade. And we are reaching or hitting or have already exceeded multiple tipping points of Earth ecosystem functioning. For example, the destruction of large parts of the Antarctic ice sheet, which could commit the planet, in effect, to a multi-meter rise of sea levels, changing the deep ocean circulation, the so-called thermohaline circulation, which could have manifold and in some cases, disastrous implications for the Earth's climate in the melting of the permafrost, with further large releases of greenhouse gases, both methane and carbon dioxide, sequestered in the permafrost, but which could be released as the permafrost melts. In other words, we're in incredible danger zones. Well, law has proved to be double-edged in all of this. The law, I would say, on the whole, has been less helpful than helpful in resolving these profound crises on the planet. And the reason is straightforward. We don't really have a deeply grounded law that gives the right to a safe environment, although that was already recognized in the Stockholm Declaration. But we do have a deeply grounded law that gives rights to private property. And private property, a system envisioned by John Locke and Adam Smith, has certain merits, but it also has profound demerits when the exercise of that private property, whether it's land use and land clearing or industrial activities that release greenhouse gases, give rise to externalities that are not part of the behavioral self-control of the private property owners. Private property, in short, is absolutely no guarantee of environmental sustainability and can mean just the opposite. It's notable that the United States Senate never ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity, for example, in part because it was argued by our right-wing senators that private property rights to do what one wants on one's own land should take a preeminent role over any kind of obligations to protect biodiversity. And so the Convention on Biological Diversity was viewed as a threat to large landowners, especially in the west of the United States, and the Senate never ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is the fundamental problem, I would say, with law. The law recognizes property rights more than it recognizes the right to a safe environment. We have not overcome this, though there have been many pioneering and path-breaking rulings by many of you and by many courts around the world that have recognized the right to a safe environment. But in the United States, this is certainly not the case. We are the land of John Locke. We are the land of private property, and private property means the right to destroy the planet under our current legal framework. A second challenge on law is that our treaty law, while ambitious in its objectives, for example, the 3 environmental treaties adopted at the Rio Earth Summit, are to a very large extent not enforced and also non-enforceable in courts in many important jurisdictions, including the United States. I think it's fair to say, legal scholars will challenge me, but I think it's fair to say in practical terms, the fact that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was ratified by the US Senate in 1992 has had essentially no implications for US law on the environment since 1992. Probably I'm wrong and overstating this a bit as a non-lawyer, but I see no recognition in public policy that the United States has obligations because it is a signatory of the UN Framework Convention. The Senate ratified the convention, but then refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, refused to recognize in any legislative form the Paris Climate Agreement. Both Obama and Biden are aiming to implement, Obama aimed, and Biden is aiming to implement the Paris Agreement through administrative actions and executive decrees rather than through law. The Congress takes no cognizance of the Paris Climate Agreement to date, and the courts almost none, as far as I know. So the domestic enforcement of international treaties, at least in the United States, is extraordinarily weak, and I think that's true in much of the world. We sign agreements, we don't implement those agreements, even when they are treaties, even when the US Constitution says the treaty is the law of the land. It has no practical implications as far as I can see. International law is also filled with contradictions that have not been resolved during this 50-year period or during the 30 years since the adoption of the multilateral environmental agreements. Let me give you at least two quick contexts. One is the investor state dispute settlement mechanism, ISDS, which is embedded in hundreds or perhaps thousands of investment treaties and bilateral trade agreements and so forth. The ISDS is essentially a remarkably conservative, property rights friendly, corporate friendly structure to stabilize the environment of foreign investors, and is now used regularly to attack governments that are attempting to implement environmental regulations, even as called for by the Paris Climate Agreement. So oil companies the world over, mining companies the world over, sue governments under investor state dispute settlement mechanisms to stabilize the tax and regulatory environment that must change if we are to implement the Paris Climate Agreement. So ISDS is completely incoherent, very dangerous, and working against environmental sustainability. The WTO rules and regulations are not designed for environmental sustainability. We don't even know to what extent they might or might not be compatible. Consider Europe's intention to put on a carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example. Is that WTO compatible? Many legal scholars say yes, it is. It will no doubt be challenged. It is a complex matter, in part because there's no clarity in WTO rules that environmental sustainability takes any kind of preference or precedence over normal free trade nostrums. And this means that while it may be possible for governments to implement trade regulations to promote environmental sustainability, they're not sure that they can, and they are subject to confusion and to challenge. We're going to need new domestic law as well in order to be able to implement a pathway to sustainability. And now many countries have commitments to reach net zero emissions, both through energy and land transformation, by mid-century, but do not have the legal and the regulatory structures in order to do that. Much of this, of course, requires legislation. Some of it will require interpretation of existing codes, or in the United States will require interpretations of basic business standards, for example. I would say areas where this is most pertinent are regarding land use, which I've already mentioned briefly, at least in the US context, gives a tremendous priority to private land use claims over and above sustainability needs. and uses of public domain law for land use are fraught with the political and legal conflict, but will be needed to implement a net zero pathway. We have also in the United States a profound confusion of company law, because in the US, especially in the state of Delaware, which governs most of our corporate law, the responsibility of the corporation is to maximize shareholder value, and boards are held accountable for that. And that often means that even taking environmentally sustainable decisions that could come at the cost of market value of the company, but to stay within planetary boundaries or within alignment of Paris Climate Agreement objectives, is not only difficult for corporate managers and boards, but could be deemed to be illegal, contrary to the responsibilities of corporations, who are told by our private property oriented courts and legal experts that they must keep a firm focus not on environmental, social, and governance investing, but on the bottom line as manifested in the capital markets and the capitalization of companies. All of this is to say, ladies and gentlemen, that not only 50 years onward have we not solved this problem, but I think that this poses a profound conceptual challenge for the law itself. Much of our law, both from its British variants and its civil code ancestry, has aimed to protect property in a way, and especially this is true, I would say, in the Anglo-Saxon system, much of it in a way that makes it extremely difficult to get the collective action to change course. And in most of the Anglo-Saxon world, we're not making any headway on this. I think civil code countries have an easier time of this because they give more recognition to the rights of government, frankly, to set a regulatory environment. Some countries have established either through the courts or the Constitution that core right to a safe environment. But overall, whether it is because of law or because of lawlessness, we, 50 years onward, are living the trajectories that we were warned against a half century ago in Limits to Growth. We are facing an increasingly fraught world. We understand much more deeply these risks than the Limits to Growth volume, because now we understand the risks to whole ecosystems, to the collapse of biodiversity, and to climate change, which were not themes, especially of Limits to Growth, but now we understand that they are our core challenges. We have to up our game in the next 20 years. We have lost a half century of time. Unfortunately, as we meet today, we are engaged in more geopolitical conflict and in open war that has completely taken the attention away from the matters that we're discussing today. And all of this means that our challenge is even greater than we might have imagined. We depend on you. This workshop, therefore, this symposium is extraordinarily timely, and I look forward to the crucial contributions that justices around the world and the law will make to achieving the future that we both want and need. Well, it is very significant. This Shanghai Cooperation Organization is, as you say, an initiative underway many years led by the Asian countries, China, India, Russia, and many others. Belarus joined in this current meeting. And more of the world is basically saying we want a different security arrangement from the one that the U.S. Has been promulgating. We want a different way to achieve collective security. We want actually more economic interconnectivity. And these are countries that often the U.S. says are enemies. They're not really enemies, but in the mindset of the security state, they are enemies, and they're going about their business, making progress, making a larger interconnected world in which the U.S. Has absented itself. So I think it is a very, very significant change that's underway. The fact that the mainstream media ignores it shows that they're basically ignorant of what's happening and not informing us.
As we speak, NATO leaders and foreign ministers are arriving in Washington, D.C. I don't know if this is Joe Biden's swan song or not, but it's a meeting of NATO. Somebody leaked a proposed conclusion of the meeting, and on that leaked document, I don't know if it's real or not, it says that NATO is of the belief that Ukraine's membership in NATO is inevitable. I mean, to make a statement like that is to be utterly, totally, completely ignorant of the past 2 years of world history, is it not?
Well, I would say not only is it not inevitable, I would say it is impossible. It is impossible because it will be resisted in every way, including up to complete disaster for the world, by Russia, which has said no to NATO enlargement to its border with Ukraine. And Russia will fight as necessary to prevent it. It will not happen. It is as realistic as saying that Joe Biden has it all together. These are just delusional, dangerous statements, though, because they basically are a way of prolonging yet another perpetual war of the United States that has no end at this point other than killing more and more Ukrainians.
What do you think will come out of?
It's just so incredibly incompetent of the American political and security leadership. But of course, we literally have a leader who is not competent mentally to do this job. And we don't really know who calls any of these shots, but they don't make sense.
Well, whoever it is has not been elected by the public. It is not transparent. As you say, we don't even know who it is. I mean, Joe Biden may be signing documents, but it's hard to believe that he can rationalize to the decisions that he needs to make. Back to NATO. What do you think will come of this meeting? More bellicosity, more support for Ukraine, more dangers for Europe, more steps in the direction of World War III?
Right now, we are adrift, and we will be adrift for a while. Biden is not competent to be president. He's not competent to negotiate. This resistance to what cries out for negotiations with Russia, with China, with the Arab leaders over the war in the Middle East. We don't have any of it happening. But now we see, though I've been begging for it and calling for it for years, it probably could not happen with Biden in the state that he is in at this point. Of course, I do think he should not remain president, much less candidate for another 4 years in this state. So what's going to come out of this? We'll have continued war and instability, lack of clarity, and yes, the rhetoric continues almost on autopilot because this has been a long-term project that doesn't yet end, even though it's causing disaster. That long-term project of expanding NATO whenever, wherever the U.S. Deep state says it should go. One of the things that will be re-emphasized at this NATO meeting is a decision taken last year, and absolutely disastrous as well, that NATO should be engaged with East Asia and with China as a threat to the West, supposedly, and thereby actually institutionalize a link of NATO with Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. It's mind-boggling. NATO means North Atlantic. It should have ended in 1990 or 1991 when the Soviet Union was ending and had disbanded the Soviet military alliance. Now they're talking about expanding to East Asia. Absolutely mind-bogglingly wrong. I think one thing that I'd like people to understand is that if you add all of the population of the United States and Canada, the population of the United Kingdom, of the European Union, of Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and the few NATO countries that one would add to that, you arrive at something around 12 to 15% of the world population. When you ask me about the Shanghai Cooperation, that's the rest. Not all the rest, because there are other parts of the world also that don't want to have anything to do with this NATO business. But we're talking about such a small part of the world that pretends it runs the show, whereas 85% of the world is saying, what are you doing? Why the wars? Why the militarization? Why all this incredibly provocative talk? Why the taunting of China? Why the continuation of war in Ukraine when neutrality for Ukraine and a buffer space between NATO and Russia would solve problems for every one of the countries? That's what the rest of the world is asking. That's what I hear every day when I speak to leaders outside of this, even call it a NATO bubble, because, you know, when you're basically no more than 15% of the world population, you're talking to yourself and you're not listening to the rest of the world.
Very, very interesting observation. You're talking to yourself and you're not listening to the rest of the world. I'm going to guess that MI6, Mossad, and the CIA were at this SCO meeting, even though the mainstream media totally and completely ignored them. Let's go to Europe.
But you know, but I think if I could just add a word about that, because there's something specific also that's happening. When we have, say, negotiations over the ceasefire, which doesn't ever happen, even though the UN Security Council has called for it in Gaza, who are the U.S. negotiators, the Israeli negotiators, and so forth? It's the CIA, it's Mossad. It is actually the secret intelligence agencies and the secret armies that are running the show, and we see them visibly at these certain moments. Why are they negotiating? What happened to the diplomats? What happened to the State Department? What happened to the ministries of foreign affairs? They don't do the negotiations. It's the intelligence agencies. That's pretty telling, actually, for how the world is actually working right now.
You have an American president who is incapable of the leadership necessary. You have an Israeli prime minister at odds with his military and intelligent establishment, and at least half the public. I guess power abhors a vacuum. I do know of one negotiator for the United States who was born in Israel and fought for the IDF and has dual citizenship, Amos Hochstein. I wonder where his heart is in these negotiations. There's no sense picking on him at the moment. But before we get into
Well, except to say that every approach that he has championed has failed,
right,
because they have had a strategy that we're going to divide the Arab world once again. We can ignore the Palestinian right to self-determination that overwhelmingly is the call of the entire world. But the United States, Mr. Hochstein and others think it can be gamed. Again, they talk to themselves. They're not talking to the rest of the world.
right.
And so we're in a kind of bubble in the U.S. foreign policy world right now that is delusional, absolutely unrealistic, and getting us deeper and deeper into war and into crisis.
One of the newcomers in D.C. is Sir Keir Starmer, the new British Prime Minister. I wish it were Jeremy Corbyn, but it's not. It's Keir Starmer, and I don't think there's going to be any change whatsoever in British foreign policy with respect to Gaza and with respect to Ukraine.
Well, he said so in the first minutes of his prime ministership. The UK basically has two characteristics. One, nostalgia for the British Empire, and so it's filled with its own delusions. And second, a decision taken decades ago, never do anything other than what the United States says, but cheerlead as much as you can for that.
Right.
And so it doesn't matter whether it's conservative or labor. This guy didn't take 5 minutes even to think, what do I do? Now I have the burdens of state. I'm engaged in a war. Do we have a look? Are there consultations? Are there opportunities for negotiation? No. From the first moment, it was, we maintain exactly the same course as the government that just went down to defeat. It's shocking. But that's because we don't think, we are just completely aligned with what the United States says we should do.
This goes back to George W. Bush and Tony Blair, does it not? This idea of Britain as America's poodle.
Well, it goes back before that, but that was an example of it, which is that Blair was told by George W. Bush Jr., we're going to invade Iraq on absolutely bizarre and phony premises. And Tony Blair said, good, we do the same. We join you. It didn't take a moment. They broke their own laws and their own processes. Later, the parliament investigated them for that. But that was not the start of this. That was the ongoing result of British foreign policy, which says just salute the United States.
How unstable is the government in France as we speak?
President Macron had recklessly talked about, of course, putting French troops into Ukraine, and he brushed aside risks of nuclear war. And
they actually launched an official TikTok account last month. And White House responded by claiming that the Biden administration's policy on TikTok hasn't changed. How do we understand this sort of seemingly inconsistent behavior?
Well, I wouldn't say that consistency is a hallmark of politics or a hallmark of U.S. politics. So none of this is surprising. There's a lot of hypocrisy. There's a lot of fear-mongering. There's a lot of grandstanding. none of it stands up to rational scrutiny.
Donald Trump, meanwhile, said he opposed the bill.
Well, that will certainly have its effect on Republican members of Congress. Trump is the clear leader of the Republican Party. He is their nominee. He has a very good chance of being reelected president. And so what he says matters in this.
But it could all just be election rhetoric that could be gone within months.
I think it's a little bit more than that, because the anti-China sentiments transcend mere election politics. They are stoked more during the election period, but we're in a not very thoughtful phase of American politics that now is more than 10 years old, in which the American political class views China as a threat and a danger, and acts, in my view, in irrational ways that make the situation worse.
Now, how do you think this year's election is going to impact Sino-US relations?
Well, first I'll tell you, as I'm sure you know, the overwhelming sentiment in the United States is, my God, this is our two choices. People are not happy with this at all. They want a different option because they're not happy with having to see this rerun between Biden, who's now 81 years old, Trump, 77, I believe. None of them spring chickens. It's actually time for new leadership and a new generation. Aside from the fact that each of these two candidates has very high disapproval ratings with the public compared to the approval ratings. So this is not a case of two popular politicians going after each other. This is a case where the American people are asking what is happening to our political system that delivers candidates we do not want. And this remains to be seen how this will be played out this year.
In the State of the Union address, President Biden emphasized the U.S.'s support for Ukraine. I know you said in a recent article that Biden and Schumer want to throw more Ukrainians' lives and more tens of billions of dollars at this glaring failure. You've also mentioned that Ukraine's security can only be achieved at the negotiating table and not by some fantasizing military triumph over Russia. Would you please elaborate for us? Why do you make such a conclusion?
When the Soviet Union was dissolved in December 1991, the American deep state took that as the moment of unipolarity, that now the United States can do what it wants, where it wants. And it decided on a strategy of expanding the U.S. military alliance as far and wide as possible. In the European context, that meant the expansion of NATO. As the Soviet Union disbanded its military alliance, which had been called the Warsaw Pact, NATO expanded into the former Warsaw Pact countries. Similarly, in East Asia, we know that the United States built new alliances and aimed to strengthen its military presence in the South China Sea region, throughout the rim of countries surrounding China. This was part of the same idea that America is the unipolar power. It should not be face competition by Russia, by China, or by any other part of the world. It was a policy of arrogance. It was bound to result in confrontation with Russia and, of course, with rising tensions with China, because if you keep pushing your alliance up to the borders of the other country, naturally you're going to create threats. By the time the NATO enlargement reached Ukraine, which is a 2,000-kilometer border with Russia, and two countries that have a very intertwined history for hundreds of years, the Russian political class said, no, stop, no farther. We don't want you, NATO. We don't want you, the United States, on our border. But the United States' attitude was, who cares what Russia thinks. We are the superpower. Russia is some second-rate regional power. That was the American attitude, even explicitly stated that way by President Obama at one point. So the United States continued to push. It helped to engineer a coup in Ukraine in February 2014 that overthrew a president that wanted neutrality for Ukraine to install a government that wanted NATO for Ukraine. And the war broke out at that point 10 years ago. It's been going on since then. I have repeatedly said the United States should acknowledge expanding NATO to Ukraine was a dangerous and unjustified idea, and one that was viewed by Russia as an existential threat, and therefore one that Russia would not allow. So I've said to the American leadership and public repeatedly, acknowledge that NATO will not expand to Ukraine, and then we can have peace in Ukraine. But the United States political class has not been willing to accept that kind of self-constraint. So until today, even now, hundreds of thousands of people dead, the United States continues to push for NATO enlargement. And just recently, the Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Jens Stoltenberg, said, Ukraine will join NATO. To my point of view, this means ongoing war. It means ongoing destruction of Ukraine. It's something that can never be achieved because Russia will fight absolutely to prevent it. And if there were rational and sane people that were thinking about the real interest of Ukraine and the interest of the world, on the Western side, they would say, this whole thing has been a bad idea. We stopped the NATO enlargement. We opened direct talks with Russia. We find a way to make peace in Ukraine. This is possible until today.
Who is benefiting in the U.S. from continuing the war in Ukraine?
Broadly speaking, of course, nobody benefits from war if we think about the overall common good. The world has suffered.
Of course.
Ukraine has suffered the most. Europe has suffered very badly. It's in open recession now because Europe lost its normal economic trade with Russia. In the United States, the public is very unhappy. Most of the public wants all of this to end. Biden is not winning any public support for the position on Ukraine. So broadly speaking, nobody wins from an ongoing war like this. But, of course, there are pockets of profiteering in war. The military-industrial complex, our major companies like Northrop Grumman or Boeing are, of course, seeing increased arms contracts, and they defend this. There are a lot of institutions, especially in the East Coast of the United States where I live, even at the universities and the Washington think tanks, that are basically funded by the military-industrial complex. So they come out for the war. The politicians say to themselves, I have arms manufacturers in my district. That's jobs in my district. I also get campaign contributions, they say to themselves, from the military-industrial companies. So they side with this. It's a bit of a game. I've called it a scam, a corruption of American foreign policy by these private interests. So the question, who gains? Basically, the world loses, but a small group does profiteer from the war and from the warmongering.
What do you think of the US's military spending? For example, in the year 2024, I believe there is a 886, I think the number is billion US dollars of military spending planned. What do you think of that figure?
Well, first of all, the figure is an underestimate because that counts only what's in the Pentagon budget. There is nuclear weapons spending in the Department of Energy. There is the so-called Homeland Security budget. There is the CIA and intelligence agencies budget. And then there's a big ticket, very sad one, called the Veterans Administration, which pays for all the disabled American veterans who have lost limbs or suffered other disasters, often lifelong, from war. That's hundreds of billions of dollars in addition. So we're well over $1 trillion a year. And this spending has gone to the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Ukraine, also the roughly 800 U.S. military bases around the world. It's a colossal waste of money. It leads to war, it leads to suffering, it leads to instability, and it has been a major factor in the accumulation of public debt in the United States. None of this is popular with the American people, so the politicians don't go to the public and say, this is so important, you have to pay taxes. No. What they do is they say, it doesn't cost you anything. We'll borrow to finance this $1 trillion. So we have a huge budget deficit, a rising debt, an unpopular policy, and this is our current situation. Of course, it stokes an arms race with China. It stokes an arms race with other countries, because if we had normal relations with China, if we had normal relations with Russia, we would all say, better that we keep our military spending low and that we don't antagonize each other, we don't threaten each other, we don't need to waste all of this money on armaments because we're not a threat to each other. That's the kind of world we should be aiming for.
In the meantime, we have a lot of foreign media, Western media, that say China is spending too much on its military budget. China's figure being about 1/4 of what is reported, as I just quoted, of what US is spending.
Yes, China has increased its military budget, but it is a fraction of the U.S. And if both sides would, actually, if we would talk with each other, if the United States had not launched another very bad idea called AUKUS, which is a new military alliance of the U.S., UK, and Australia, for example. Oh, what a waste of money, waste of time, threat to China, useless for all of us, useless. If we had not gone that way, we wouldn't need all of this increase of military spending. So I really put the onus on the United States, which has been spending more than the next 10 countries combined on military spending, to stop wasting our own money in the United States and to say to the rest of the world, we can move back to a situation of arms control and normal diplomatic relations rather than confrontation. This is, of course, what we need.
The dollar's share of global reserves is expected to continue its trend of slipping as emerging market and developing economies are seeking further diversification in the currency composition of their reserves. What is going on? What's wrong with the dollar? Will it become stronger or weaker going forward?
Over time, the share of international transactions in the dollar will surely diminish. And that could happen faster than people expect. Right now, rough estimates say that about 60% of all international trade and financial settlements occur in dollars. And by occurring in dollars, it means occurring in the international banking system that deals in dollars, mainly in Europe and in the so-called SWIFT settlements. The problem is twofold, actually threefold. One is that the relative share of the U.S. in the world economy is falling gradually, but it's declining, and it's going to continue to decline. So why should so much of the world's transactions be in dollars? The second is that there are new technologies for making settlements, such as digital central bank currencies, which China, the People's Bank of China, has been experimenting with in recent years, and I think will continue to develop. This means you don't have to go through the banking system in the same way for settlements, and certainly not the U.S. banking system. But the third problem is that the United States came to view this important role of the dollar as a weapon of foreign policy. Look at the freeze of Russian financial assets, $300 billion frozen of Russian assets because the United States said, so basically. And Russia is not alone. This has happened to Afghanistan, to Iran, to Venezuela, to North Korea, to others. The United States decides unilaterally that your assets are our assets now, that you can't use the dollar trading system. And of course, countries are waking up to this vulnerability. Who wants to have their reserves confiscated? Who wants to be blocked from international trade because there isn't an alternative mechanism? So the aim of the BRICS this year is, in fact, to develop non-dollar payments mechanisms.
Right.
My experience and view is this is not so hard. So I think that there will be ways to settle in renminbi. There will be ways to settle in rupees. There will be ways to settle in rubles. There will be perhaps a new unit of account established to facilitate non-dollar settlements. I think the BRICS will come up with some interesting ideas this year, and that will accelerate the shift out of dollars.
And Professor Sachs, you predicted that the hegemony of the US dollar will end within, I think you said, 10 years. How does this time frame of a decade come about? What makes you decide it's 10 years?
Of course, it's a guess, so let me be clear about that, because nobody can predict the future with the accuracy at a time like this. But my view is that the idea that the dollar must be used is a great exaggeration. There are many economists, my counterparts, who say, well, there is no alternative. This I do not believe. My own experience is that the currency is not the fundamental part of an economy. It's the mechanism for settling transactions. And it can happen in many different currencies. You can invent the euro. You can internationalize the renminbi. You can create even new currencies. I've been involved in that in 2 countries, helping governments to introduce new national currencies. So my view is that it's easier than it looks to make the workaround from the dollar. Of course, if the U.S. foreign policy changed and became far more cooperative and trustworthy, maybe the U.S. dollar would sustain a longer reign as the dominant currency. But if the relations between the U.S., China, Russia, and others remain very fraught, there will be substitutes. That's my main point. And they will be easier to come up with than is currently believed, and it will happen faster than is currently believed. And my example, I would say, of justifying that view is that the U.S. believed that the sanctions against